Right, today we're going to take a look at web, mobile, and motion design. Let me unmute those. So when we start thinking about web, mobile, and motion design, the big thing with it is we're still using the same foundational skills. We're still thinking about layout. We're still talking about text and images. The big thing though when we start getting into here is we start focusing a little bit more into technology. There's a little different experience that our audience expects to get out of things that are interactive in nature. Because when we go and really start to talk about it, when we deal with web, mobile, and motion design, we're talking about interactive design. When we start getting into interactive design, there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of go with interactive design. This really focuses more on the tech side of it. When we get into interactives, we start working in designing, class designing for digital environments, and we really get into the fact that we have high tech, we have low tech, and we have no tech. So as we start to think about interactives, how can we go in and begin to use the interactives? This is going to focus on tech, and the fact that we're dealing with web, mobile, and motion. I wouldn't say that we're necessarily on high tech. Some of the stuff is more like in the low tech standpoint, because once we create it, it's all touching the screens and things like that. So we're getting an understanding of what people are going to want and expect from interactive experiences. The big thing you're going to find as we start to go through here is that your audience is going to expect interactives. No longer, it used to be, wow, if there's an interactive, great, it's awesome. But now it's to the point to where your audience is going to go in and going to expect them. And there's a lot of things we can actually go through and use them for, which is very beneficial to us as a communicator. We'll go through and grasp what a website is. Most of you, of course, have all used a website. Many of you have probably even gone and designed websites before. We'll start looking at the key steps in website design and development. Also talking about what happens on the front end, what we're seeing in the back end as to what's happening when we go in and we begin working with and clicking on things. Understand design concept and visualization as we apply it to web design. So when we go and we start to think about what happens with it, developing a design concept, same way we develop any other design concept. So we go and we start to deal with visualization. What's going to happen with that? How are we going to know how these pages are ultimately going to link together? Realize the need for engaging content. If we don't get our audience attention, they're not going to actually interact with it. So how are we going to go about engaging them? As we start to work with it, everybody has some sort of mobile device. How do we go through and we start to work with items that go from what used to be just web onto the mobile? And then also understand when we start getting into visual or the screen-based media, what happens with the basics on there. We're going back in there, we're starting to think about pixels versus going in and having print designs, which as we build those, once we print them, we essentially have the ability to change what our pixel size is. When we go in and we start working with a screen, the pixels are already defined by the user. So what's going to happen, we go in and we bring those things into it. So we go in and we start to think about or start to work with things that are web, mobile, really we get into the digital environments out of here, is to know that what's going to happen is we're working collaboratively. If you're a web designer, it's rare that you're going to be the one who's doing everything, all the hard coding and everything in there, and what is it going to actually go and tap into. So with that, we have our front-end designers. We're making it look good and everything. We have the back-end designers and developers that are going to go in and start to deal with the coding and make things ultimately go in and function. But really we get into starting to look at motion graphics or anything digital-wise is that you're going to have a large group. You're going to have people that know the technology. You're going to have people that are going in to deal with the user interface, the user experience. You're going to have programmers on the backside. If you're the visual designer, you're doing all the stuff with there. You have to communicate with all of these people. We go through, if you're working in a larger group, you're going to have strategists that are going to go in and they're figuring out, okay, this is how we're going to build this, where it needs to be at. You're going to have people who are going to look at all of the data and analyze exactly where is this going to go to. Along with that, you're going to be starting to look at what are people using. If you go through and we start having tracking devices, you can track motion of the mouse. When people go to your site, what happens? Where does the mouse go through it? What's really neat when you go through and start to look at that, if you have the software loaded onto something and have people go in and work through a web page and just, all it does is tracks mouse movements. It's funny to see what, as you break down the demographics, kids get on there, where do kids go? And you go in there and start to about 20s to 40s, where do they go? The 40s to 60s, where do they go? So we can really look at everything that's in there. If we go and we start getting into motion stuff, we might have animators. So when we talk about animators, you could have 3D animators and 2D animators. So as we get into start working with stuff that falls into the area of these digital interactive experiences, the range of people that are going in and working on everything is going to be great. I don't know who this. So as we go in and start thinking about what are we using, who are we working with, who's going to go in and be doing the designs. The other thing we start getting into is we start looking at the creative teams is how we go through and ultimately develop them. It's really going to go in and start to look at who's on your team, who's available to you. Are there times in which what we're capable of doing is based upon who we have on staff? Yeah, I mean, sometimes we get into the point where just based upon the budget, because we know the budget drives everything, and we don't have the ability to go out and hire a 3D animator to come in and work on this and pay them $15,000 for the job. We just don't have that. So when we go through and we start to look at it, your creative teams are going to look at the talent that's there. You as a person on the team needs to look at what do you have to add to them. So with this, I bring these skills. Somebody else brings other skills. How are you going to make those things go through and work together? On the smaller companies, you're going to find yourself doing a lot of different things, wearing a bunch of different hats. If you get into a larger team, they're going to bring you in specifically for one thing. So if you're really good in one application, they're going to push everything to you, and you're going to be doing the stuff inside of there. So as you start to think about where you're going, what you're working with, understand where you fall inside of that. The other thing we start getting into is we look at the user. So we start dealing with things that are human-centered in design. What is that user going to do? So we go through and we start to work with your website, or we go through and we start to work with the interactives. Your audience wants to go in and quickly be able to understand what's the user interface, how do we go about navigating it, what do the icons mean inside of there. So start looking at the overall, the GUI. How are we moving inside of that? As you go through and work with it, it's important that we test things out. Because as we go in and ultimately begin to work with things, using these media experiences are designed to, of course, engage your audience. So as we start to think about what is it that they want, so what information are we passing off? Are we dealing with entertaining them? Are we going in to try to educate them? And what exactly is the purpose of putting that inside of there? Those interactives are pushing to the audience. We're communicating. How many things are going to be into it? So as we start to work with that, type basics come back into play. So what are we doing with our typographics? What typefaces are we choosing? Remember, it's okay to go through and we can start to work with things that give us a heading to it. So the headings can be in a nice, more elegant, fancy type because we have the scale to work with. But when we get into larger bodies of copy that we're going to go through and read, start to be aware of what's going to happen with that. So we go in and we begin to work with designs or start to think about what's going to happen with it. We're talking about screen-based media. So since we are dealing with screen-based, what are we going to go through and start to think about? So the first off, we go and we start looking at all of our screens that are available to us. Is what are the communication goals? So what is it that we want to communicate? What are we going to do to be able to communicate this information? What are the constraints? So as we go in and we start to think about what screen's being used, what are the constraints with it? What's one of the drawbacks to, let's go to the mobile phone. What's one of the drawbacks?
The screen is usually very skinny.
Yeah, so small screens. What's that? You said it, so it becomes relevant at that point. Everything's relevant in one way or another. So we have the size of the screens. When we start to think about that, we have constraints on there, possibly dealing with brightness. So how many images or how many colors can they actually go through and show? As technology advances, yes, we're getting more and more advanced on these. If we go back, even 10 years ago, it's an entirely different experience being on a smartphone versus being on a tablet versus being on a desktop. We start looking at the content. What is that we can actually show on those individual screens? Because when we go through, if we start talking about those constraints, well, depending on what we show, how much real estate do we have? So we start talking about user interfaces, how much space do we have, what is that we can show on there? We go through and start to deal with the technical constraints. How exactly are we going to go in and ultimately deliver it? So what is it we're using? When we talk about that on the delivery, we're also talking about dealing with software. What's the software that we're going to be using inside of there? If there are devices that we have to select something, how are we actually going to be selecting that? Is it a touch screen with a mouse to it, or dealing with a joystick? So what goes into working with those? On that, the constraints we go in there, we're looking at size and resolution of screens. The larger the pixels are, well, when we start dealing with text, then the larger the text is going to have to be so that we don't get those jagged edges to it. The browser and browser's posture. So what's the rotation and setup of our browser? What browser are we using? If you go through and you start designing for the web, make sure that the stuff functions in multiple browsers. If it's going to tap into some other area, does it work or does it not work? When you start getting into things that are working with Chrome, if you're dealing with anything that's Google based, they push you to use Chrome. Of course, because that's their platform. So does it work, does it not work inside of there? Is it going into Internet Explorer?
Internet Explorer.
Is that buggy as can be? So how do they work with them? As we get to the Mac side, Safari works great with some things and it's trash with other things. So when we start getting in there, make sure that you're testing these things out. What do we have for margins and padding? So when we start dealing with the margins of the screen, what do we have to work with? How much padding do we have between objects as well? It's all pixel based. What do we have for libraries? Areas that we can actually go in and work with. What do we have overall for real estate space? What do we have for viewport? Viewport's how we're actually going in and seeing what is there. And then are you designing things to allow for advertising units? So essentially we go and we start looking at places where Google and stuff like that can put their ads in there. Do we have that available and how much is there and what's going to happen with it? Because that's part of the real estate that we have to work with, is to go in and think about how are we going to accommodate those things that come in and make us money.
What if your website is also an ad, like the Goldfish Crackers website? Would you need other ads on it then?
So if you're working with a proprietary site that's used to sell your product, you're probably not selling ads to anybody else. When we start talking about it for this, is if you start working for, say, a newspaper, and you're laying out something that's going to have that stuff in there, then you're going to put locations on there because that's where your funding is going to start coming from, is ads. But yeah, company, if you're working with Pepsi, Pepsi's not going to have any other ads on there. Right. So with it, yeah, when you're talking about something specifically for a company, a regular company that sells products, then they're focused on their products. What would look like normal ad space on there would most likely be advertising their other products, if anything were on there.
So like Pepsi would be advertising one of their other drinks.
Right. You could get onto, I mean, you could get onto the Pepsi site, and all of a sudden they might have up that new Mountain Dew Melon Blast or whatever it's called. I don't drink pop anymore, so it's really kind of weird to. I don't keep up on what the new ones
I
are.
don't drink too much pop, I do drink some.
So I know they've got a few different ones. They got like 2 new summer drinks out there. Anyone know what they are? Pretty sure one's melon something or other. I want to say melon. What is it?
Mango?
There's a mango?
I get a cherry
Huh.
soda from Andy
I have
Cherry.
no idea. I don't keep up with the soda community.
Huh. I don't either.
Soda fandom.
That's
Neither.
what I was thinking.
So when we go and we start to think about it, you know, the key as we go through and start to build what's inside of here is to start to think about what is it that your audience is ultimately going to want. So what is the big picture that you're going for? As we go through to start to push that, we need to start to think about what are people going to be looking for? What is the visitor coming into? So as we start to think about the design, we start to build into it, what are they coming there to look for? What can we do to assist the person in working through whatever it is we have for that interactive element? So we go into websites. Steve Jobs always talked about he hated the back button because it's all that forward thinking. How can we allow people to continue to feel like you're moving forward? Even if you're essentially creating a circle. If you go in there and you tell people, all right, walk over to this building, you walk around the corner, you go into a classroom, you have them come out and you have them go around again. Even if you get somebody walking in circles, you still feel like you're actually gaining ground. If it takes you 30 minutes to get somewhere, and one route takes you and you're stuck in traffic, and another route takes you where you're driving the entire 30 minutes, which one are most people going to ultimately choose? How many people in here like sitting in traffic? How many people in here enjoy driving if you're driving somewhere, like moving? Yes. So that's what it goes back to. It's all psychological. We're moving. It's taking us 30 minutes to still get from point A to point B. But if I spend that 30 minutes sitting in traffic, stop and go, stop and go, stop and go, versus driving for 30 minutes, I'm going to drive the 30 minutes versus sitting in traffic. That's just the way we work. So that's the whole thing as we go through and start to think about it. Respecting the visitor, though, we're going to streamline how we're going to work through this so we know how to get into it. As we start to design based upon what we have for that specific device. So as we go through and start to think about the devices that we're building, what can that device do? How are people going to use that device? If we go through and we start to think about those elements as we go in and build it, we know what's going to happen with it. What's the major difference between your smartphone and tablet versus a desktop most of the time?
Phones and tablets are majorly more compact, so you can take them places easier.
More compact?
And you gotta use your fingers for them.
Yes. So input, how do we go through and input it? Now some of you may be able to grab your smartphones and sit there and have a conversation with somebody and still text while you're going through. How you doing? Yep. And sending an email at the same time you're having a conversation with somebody else. I can't do that. A friend of mine from South Dakota on the old, when you had to, push the buttons to go to the numbers or the letters, how he did it, I have no clue, but he could sit there and talk to you, not even look at his phone, and pushing, or pushing the one button 3 times to get to C, and he could sit there and write an entire message that way while having a conversation with you, and the message was perfect. So as we go through to start to look at it, we have to understand how are they using them, what are they used for. So input device. How much do we want people to have to go in and type stuff on their smartphone and tablet versus what we would have on a desktop experience? So as we go through, we start to think about how are they using them, what are they using them for? We probably don't need a huge in-depth interactive piece if we're going in there and they're simply getting on their phone and part of the app is to go into finding directions. We have a directions button, you click once, it pulls up, you click OK, and you have your directions. So make sure you're designing it in a usability based upon how they're going to be using it, where they're going to be using it. If somebody's looking for something quick on a smartphone, they're probably not going in there to dig in there to read a huge article about what's going on. So we really start to think about what is on there. Look at the interactions with them. Where is it located at? Prior to COVID, nobody really thought a whole lot about going up to kiosks all the time. You go to the airport and you're checking in with the kiosk and no one sits there and thinks, I'm probably like a 3,000 person who's touched this screen today. Nobody really thought that much about it. I mean, obviously, still washing their hands and that, but it's at that point in time, you would use it and you'd go on your other stuff and then you'd worry about going over there. Now you use one of those things and then the hand sanitizer station's right next to you. You go, yep, I need some of that. So we start looking at what's being used. Now we have to start to think about, okay, well, based upon the location of this, what are people going to think about wanting to use this? Some people just will not use things like that right now. Nope, I'm not touching it. I'll go and grab a representative from the airline and come up and say, okay, here's my stuff, and they'll put it down to scan it, and they're like, I'm not touching the screen though, you can punch in the rest of my information. One bag. Yep, that looks right. Yep, that looks right. And then they go through and they put the stuff on there. So as we start to think about that, how are they ultimately going to be using it? Pulling information. So we go through and we start to think about what exactly are we working with. This allows us to go in, we're trying to bring you in. You want to gain information quickly. That's the reason why you're inside of this. If we go through and we start looking at using things to entertain you, we want to be entertained quickly. We don't want it to go through a lot of reading. So like for me, if you go into it and we start talking about gaming things, and they talked about a long time, I shouldn't say a long time ago, but talking about gamifying education, it's because that's an interactive way of going and working. If people feel as though they have a choice in what they're learning, they're going to end up learning more because they're going to spend more time engaged in what's going on with that. So the same thing we go through and we start working with this is we're trying to go in and we're trying to get people who are interested in information or entertainment, really. So are we trying to go in and inform you on something, or are we trying to go in and ultimately entertain you with it? But anytime that we go in and we really start to work with interactives create an experience. If we enjoy the experience, we continue it. If we don't enjoy the experience, we leave. So as we go through and start to think about that, that's what we're doing with the interactives as we're bringing these people in, as we're engaging them on these screens, is we are providing them what they are ultimately going in and looking for. The other thing as we go in and start to look at it is, as you start to look at it, it's not only it's for yourself, it's also thinking about the people that are around you. It's going in there and say, would someone share this with a friend? So if you go and you start to see this stuff, is this something you'd want to share with somebody or not? If it's not something you would share with somebody, why? What is it missing? What do you need to add into it to get people to come back into it? So we start to think about that as we go through and begin to build it, is that target audience. If you wouldn't share it with a friend, are you part of the target audience? If you are part of the target audience and you wouldn't share it, why not? And that's the question we need to go in and really start to dig into and start to see, okay, if we won't, why? So we start getting into that target audience. It can be age-based, it can be culture-based, it can be dealing with socioeconomic groups. So as we start to think about it, it could even simply be the device you're using. Some people, there's things created and they create them strictly for Apple devices, so it's iOS-based. There's other people who work for Android stuff and they do it only so it's going to be Android OS based. So as we start to think about those, what happens with it? Who is the group? What is the flexibility as we get into developing them? So what are the devices that it's going to go onto? We start to think about designs. In the past, kiosk designs were all built in an entirely different way than they are now. Now we can go in and all we need is an electrical outlet because we have Wi-Fi pretty much everywhere anymore. You put it on an iPad, you just plug that in, you put it inside the kiosk design, you lock it up, and people can interact with it just like that the whole time. So now we're finding the fact that if you go back a few years, it's devices weren't everywhere. People, we were dependent on the consumer bringing their own device. Now, with the cost of devices and everything, we can actually provide devices and put devices in a location. Just sit and think about how many places in which you see a computer or a tablet now that didn't have them in the past. You used to go to libraries, there might be 2 computers in a library that you could use, and people are sitting there waiting to get on a computer to be able to use them. And now you walk into libraries and everything is a computer. I mean, you can punch in what book you want right there, and it'll give you a printout as to where it's located. You can go in there and you can request books and leave and come back in a couple hours, and somebody else will go and pull them off the shelf, and they're sitting in a bundle neatly tied, and you just walk in and pick up the bundle. Yes?
There's still like 2 computers in the library. Now practically there's a computer or 2 everything.
Yeah, and that's just what's happening with devices. So
They're
as you
becoming more
start to
accessible.
think about it from a designer's standpoint, is that everybody's going to be engaging with them. What is the user interface on them? Some of them, some of the sites, I still question their search bars are, I feel, hidden. You get in there and it doesn't. There's no longer the block that that says search. Sometimes it's just. I mean, if you don't see the little line underneath that's indicating that there's a box there, you don't even know that there's a search box. So as we start to use stuff, what's happening with it? What are the devices? Where are they at? You know, how are we going to go through and allow people to understand what is there? As we go through, we start to design it. Design based upon the content that's going to be in there. So as we go through and start to think about what is it? Are we having video in motion? Are we just dealing with pictures? With those pictures, does it become a slideshow? Do we have just individual fixed images on it that people can look at with captions on them? Is there a lot of text? Is there little text? So all that stuff has to go in. You just start to think about what's in there. If we're starting to deal with lists. If we're dealing with something that you're looking at a list, most likely, if we're talking about a smartphone, you probably want it to be in portrait orientation so that more stuff is on the screen at a time. If we're dealing with text that's a wider type of text, you know, what's going to happen when you go through and interact with that? As we start looking at the development of pages, you know, where are people using them? There's certain websites that I've gone to with research purposes that get frustrating to go on to. They don't access very well on a smartphone. If you've ever gone to, like, I'll just pull like court systems. If you're going in there to do research on court cases, it's miserable to work with on a smartphone most of the time because you'll get in there, you'll get to the page, you got to turn it sideways and scroll a bit so you can just barely hit the button that has a checkbox on it to allow you to the next page, and okay, well then you got to rotate it the other, because they're not designed, they're not intended for the main user to be somebody on a smartphone. But I do a ton of my research on my smartphone because it's what I have all the time. So I'm sitting somewhere, I've got 15 minutes because I'm waiting for someone to make my food, and I'll pull it up and I can start doing research and pulling PDF documents down, storing them into the cloud for me to go and pull up later on a computer or print off later. But again, it's just that interactivity. What are you using? How are you going to go in and use it? So in this case, they designed it based upon the device and the content that's going to be in there. Not anticipating or figuring that most of the people are going to be on their smartphones, which kind of surprises me because to me, you start thinking about legal people and lawyers and that they're constantly moving, going somewhere else. So you would think that it would be designed a little bit better for a smartphone, but that's just me. So as we start to think about it, how are those things going to go in and play with it? And then that's also important for you to go in and test the stuff out on those. So we start talking about visual design. Again, we're talking about how clear is the information and how are we ultimately going to be engaged by it. So those are the key things as we go in and start to think about the visual design. How do we find the information? We want it to be easy. Think back to when they started with the hamburger menu on smartphones. Because for the longest time, smartphone, what you saw for a web page on the smartphone was exactly the same thing. Responsive design didn't exist. I mean, we literally, you go in there and if you go all the way back, you guys can remember that far back. Most of you would have been kids. But you get into the standpoint, you know, the first iPhone came out in what year? Any guesses?
2000 something.
Well, yeah, 2000 something. 2007.
My mom had to go to the iPhone.
So when you go through and you start looking at that, they haven't been around long. So, I mean, we haven't even, because I'm pretty sure it wasn't until like June of 07. I think we're about the middle of the year. So we're not even at 15 years. So when those came out, we were going to the exact same websites. So when you went on there to, apple.com, you were going to regular website because we weren't dealing with all of these different screens. We didn't have all the tablets. We didn't have the closest thing we can get through to when we start talking about responsive was the fact that depending on how nice your monitor was or the graphics processor in your old computer, and at that time most of them were all still towers, that was the responsiveness of it, was how many pixels did I have on the screen, but still not a major shift in the overall concept. Now we have all kinds of different screens that we have to go through and start to use, so start to think about that as we go through to build them. That's when we get into that responsiveness. So based upon the variety of it, yes?
So as a designer, which would you prefer, or which is easiest, going from big to small or small to big? Because when I'm developing a website or coding it, not like actually sitting down and designing it like XE or something, I prefer to go small to big.
So on that, it's usually easier to start small and go big. The same thing if I go through and I start talking, when I get into like designing logos, I always talk about making sure your logo can be viewed nicely at 1 inch by 1 inch, because when we go 6 feet by 6 feet, you're going to still be able to see it. So really it goes back to looking at what is the overall plan of where is this most likely going to be viewed at, what's the focus. If you're designing something that 95% of the people that view this are going to view it on a desktop because it's just how it's designed to function. It's where it functions. There's too much information for you to really go through and work with it on a smartphone. Then you're going to, of course, start on the web, the computer-based setup. But it is usually easier to start smaller and get larger because at that point you just gain additional space and you can start to break down. So it's whether you're going in and becoming more concise, or that you can actually go through and start to break out, whether you're going deductive or inductive when we go through and start looking at information-wise.
Because I've seen a lot of companies who do just a desktop website and then kind of really too much information to do mobily on like Safari or something like that. They kind of transition to building like a native app for the phone. That's kind of the light version.
Right, and that's kind of the process that most go to. You'll have, even your larger corporations, they do it. You have a website that's designed on a website, but if you're going to go in and interact with it, most of the time it'll even be set up to where on the responsive design, when you go ahead and you punch in Pepsi.com and it recognizes that the width of the screen is below this many pixels, it'll pop up and recommend or list for you to click and go right to the App Store and download their app. Bless you.
Thank you.
So as we go through to work with it, I typically, if I'm looking at stuff, I tend to start small and then work my way up as well, because again, if I can see that small, then I know large is going to work. The downfall you sometimes have is depending on how you're dealing with the size of type in that, you may have to make a little bit of adjustments when you scale it up because your type will just be massive. But as you mentioned, most places are going, if they have a lot of information and they want to share it, they're gonna do an app as well. So starting to look at that, we start talking about a responsive grid inside of programs. Even like Dreamweaver, you can go through and you can set and you can trigger what's inside of there. There's a lot of applications now that are allowing you to go in and set information. So as you go in and set it up, they just start working with content areas, so you can develop content that goes into there. Based upon the size of the screen, it shuffles where that content would be aligned. And all that happens with that is it's literally when you go through and you punch in the address, it essentially sends back, requests the size of the screen, it feeds it back, and then runs you into there. You don't see anything that changes inside of the other thing you can also get if you take your browser window and you simply scale your browser window down, you'll see that everything will start to shift then as well. So there's a couple ways you can see what's happening inside of your responsive design. We go there and we start looking at the screen's aspect ratio. So we start talking about width to height, depending on what it is that we're going through and working with plays into that along with the orientation. So if we go through and we start to look at your iPad really looks at the width. You know, when we start looking at it from holding it sideways there, is that it's 4 to 3. So it goes back to, if we start thinking about what was standard definition TV, was 4 by 3. That's how the iPad was originally designed. So when you start to think about it, you're going to have your black bars above and below videos that are in 16 by 9 if you're watching them on an iPad. Whereas we go through and we start looking at your iPhone, the iPhones, I mean, I know they shift based upon which one you have, roughly 3 by 2. So I don't know what it is with these in this classroom. But somewhere around here they must live. So as we start to look at what's happening with that, your width, height, and also the native orientation of it. So is it landscape, portrait, as we go through and work. And then we get in and we start looking at the code. Now those of you that are into coding or interested in coding, there's a lot of different ways we can talk about code or go into what code. Code is actually a design tool because yes, you are designing the interaction and how those go in and work with one another. So what is it you're working with? You know, you're dealing with the animations. I know the bee flew over there by you. Is he behind you?
It's on top of me.
I don't have really anything to smash in. I guess I could use my notepad. But when we start getting into the code and yep. Buzzing around. No pun intended. Oh well. But we start looking at the experience with it, getting into the coding, and we talk a little bit about code. We work briefly with code, but there are other applications that you'll be using in the interactions, or we go through and we start linking content or linking layers and stuff inside of other applications. Do still work off of the code. So if you understand the code, start to recognize the code, it can assist you in designing things. The other thing also with it is we start thinking about code, we start about interactions. Yes, when we start talking about inputting things, if we start inputting things into fields and allowing it to go through and it goes to the next screen, what's going to happen for what's it going to output. So when we start dealing with I/O, that can come into play as we start getting in to coding. So when we go through and we start working, or as you start thinking about designing, I do encourage you to go out there and get into pages, play with pages, look at pages. There's a lot of award-winning websites out there, and I'm pretty sure that's even what I have the assignment based off of for this. Yeah, that's what this one is. So is to experience it. So over the course of the next week, and then you're going to go in and really start to experience some different websites. They'll link to award-winning websites. You can see what people are using. Because the biggest thing to do is to get out there and start to see what is being used. So as we go in, we start to think about our websites, or you start to get into designing websites. You need to go up and come up with a plan. So really plan out what it is that you're going to do. Start to think about this stuff. Orientate yourself to the problem that is at hand. Like, what is it that we're going to go in and use? What is it that we're trying to set? What are your goals? What are the guides for this? So leading you into what's happening with it. And then ultimately start to identify who is inside your group. What expertise do you have available to you? What expertise do you need? I'm a buzz killer. So we go through, we start to work with it, understand what you have, who you're going to need for it. A lot of this sometimes guides into just how much you can do. So when we start thinking about it, even when I start looking at things here on campus, there are things that I'd love to be able to do, and then there's things that I realize that we just don't have the people available or the time available to go through and create them. So start to think about what's going to go into those items. We go in and we start looking at design brief. You know, what is it that we are going to go in and be building? What is it that we want to have with this? That's your strategy. Remember, this is overall what we're trying to do with this. So does it relate to a different brand, a broader brand, larger corporation? Does it expand out into communication? what exactly are we trying to do with this? Where is it trying to put us at? The other thing we can do, any other things that we plan to or want to communicate with this are also going to fall inside of this area. So as we start to get into it, we start to build this, what exactly do we want to make out of it? Look at other websites, other websites that are out there. What are we trying to work with? What are they doing? What do we want to do? What are the ones that we want to differentiate ourselves from? Who is our audience? What is our goal? All of those things go into what it is that we're ultimately going to be working on. So think about the site structure. So when we go through and we start to build things out, we talk about mind mapping. Well, we want to go through and still even mind map. How are people most likely going to go on here? As we start to plan those pieces, based upon what we know inside of that mind map, okay, what do we have for menus? So on these upper menu items, what do we have then for sub-menus? How much information has to go inside of there? What do we have then technology-wise? What's going to challenge us? So if we're looking at it, is it the amount of space that we have technology-wise? Is it the fact that we're going to need multiple applications? The fact that we can't write, one set of code that's going to work on both operating systems between iOS and Android? Is it something we start getting into going on to desktops now? The HTML, HTML5, CSS, we start to think about those elements. How is that going to play into it? Are there things that we can't do because of the way that we need to deliver it? If so, how can we provide a similar experience without having to use those technologies? Maybe we can't deliver a full interactive 3D experience that people can go through and can do a fly-through and control exactly what's happening with it. But can we, on our own system, go through and create that same 3D model, create a fly-through, record it as a video, and provide that video as an opportunity for somebody to still experience what we wanted them to be able to control, but they can't? Yes. So as we start to think about those things, what is that we're able to work with, and how can we go in and ultimately work around those problems? Content outline. So what exactly do we need in there, content-wise? Go through and start to break down what content is going to be in there. How we're ultimately going to go through and use them. And then conceptual design. So in that idea here is we're looking at generating now that overall concept of the design based upon what it is that we've covered inside of the brief, and also what it is that we have as our strategy as we go through and begin to move forward. Visual design. Now, as we get into starting to work with our visual design, there's a few things we need to be aware of. Are we using a grid or some sort of template? You'll be amazed now how many people are using templates. There's a lot of sites out there that people are going in, like your Wix, and they're simply using a template that's there, and then replacing images, changing colors, of course adding in then the branding elements to that template that's there, and they're doing fairly well. A friend of mine is an illustrator and graphic designer, and he got into doing a bunch of websites, and he does very well making websites, and all of his websites that he's builds come straight out of Wix. Grabs a template, goes in there and does all of the design work for them, and then publishes them up, and like I said, makes decent money with it. So we go through, we start to think about it. This is, if we have templates that are already there, we don't have to think so much about where things are going, if that template works for the organization that you're working with. But we still have to go in, we still have to start to decide what we're doing with our type. We have to start thinking about what's happening with our colors, what images are in there, how are we actually navigating the page, what's the overall style of the photos and the illustrations and any other artwork that might be inside of there. Now, the big challenge we get in, we start working with these, is that have to start thinking inside of our visual design about the images for the screen, and also start looking at web type. So we start thinking about working in the web type. Really, we're going back into and starting to look at something that has very neutral typography to it. That's because if we go through and we choose things that are your classic web-based fonts, what's going to happen with that is they're going to show up properly on any machine. The other thing that you may or may not be aware of as you go in and start working with different browsers is you can actually go and you can define what the default fonts are for the individual browser. So when it goes and pulls up, this is how it's going to look. Now, each of the systems have very similar default fonts, so with that you typically don't see a whole lot of difference from screen to screen. We go over and we start thinking about, like I said, we talked about grids on there. Think about how people are going to see it, and also the number of ultimately pages that you're going to have as you go through and bring it up. So starting to think about the screens. As we go through, you start to go through and work with a website. A website is an experience. It's an interactive. The other thing it is, it also has a story. There's a narrative as to what you are saying when they go and begin to move through there. So with that in your mind, you should also have an idea, this is how people are most likely going to work their way through our interactive piece. So think about that. With interactives, we definitely storyboard them out. With websites, we don't typically storyboard them out. We will wireframe, and we will talk about the overall information architecture as to how we're ultimately expecting them to work through there and what information is set. Because anytime we go through and people enter our web page or enter an interactive, they're on a story. We're there to guide them. Do we guide them by saying click here, click there? No. We guide them by setting it up to where this leads to the next one, leads to the next one, because it's that logical flow that exists inside of what is here. Experience design, like I said, there is an intended user experience. So when we go through and we start looking at that flow in there, we get into the personas, and we start getting digital, we'll talk a lot about personas. If you end up taking anything on user interface, user experience, you'll see personas, you'll hear personas. When we get into any designs for a digital standpoint, we're going to get into the personas. And these really are just, they're imaginary, but they are based on the demographics that we're anticipating. But they're these imaginary setups that actually represent who our users are. So it goes into detailed stuff. Betty's 56, homemaker who lives in the Midwest, grew up in the Midwest, that likes coffee in the morning, long walks on the beach in the evening. And you really go dig into that, because what it starts to tell you about, though, is we understand the personal habits, and then we also understand the interactions that they're going to have with our object, and then how do we go through and guide them inside of there. So we go through and we start to look at what's happening as we go through and we start to design these experiences. We start to think about their forms and their functions with that. Really what we kind of go into, and this isn't in the book, is they utilize the acronym of ROPE. So with that is, for the R, we want to respect the user's time and goals. So why are they here? They need to find stuff easy. They need to be able to either read it or print it or possibly even download it, which allows them to go in and use it. So the big thing that we start looking at here is that as we go in and start to work with it, is we want to bring something immediately to their attention. If they know it's there, they're going to interact with it. We go into the O, that's the offer a media-rich experience. So what we have available to us in here, let's utilize it. If we can do that, if we can show them that instead of making them read it, let's go ahead and let's take advantage of that. The P is prototype and test. So what does that mean when we go through and start to work with it, is that they should load quickly. If we have videos on it, they should load quickly. Images should load quickly. All of the content should load quickly, because again, we're back to respecting the user's time and goals. As we go through and start to build it, test the stuff out. If we have to, go in and strip the images down. So if you're working with images that can be shown really large, but you're incorporating them into this object, they're never going to view it. If it's a 4K, they're never going to view it on their phone at 4K. We don't need it at 4K. What can we do to, of course, reduce that down? So make sure you prototype and test and look at load times and how things actually go through and play. And then E is our engage the visitor. So in this case, we want to create visual interest with them through a standard visual hierarchy that's also available with it. So as you go through and you start to work with these things, we need to go in, let's talk about prototype. So jumping back. So with that, as we start to prototype, we are going into low fidelity prototypes. So when we get into low fidelity, these can be pieces of paper. Okay, how are you going to go to? What are you going to go to next? Okay, how are we going to move through here? What are we seeing on that? We can even go as much as taking and creating a little viewport and have people move that around to be able to see what's going to be able to be seen on there when we go and we start to deal with the overall size of it. So what are some other ones? There's a lot of different prototyping tools that are available to us in websites. We can go through and we can put in there, even from a standpoint of interactives. Adobe XD is great for creating quick interactives. So with that, there are images that we can place in there. We can also do just entire artboards. So if we had a layout, we could take a screenshot of it, post it on an artboard, and then how would you ultimately go about navigating inside of it, just to see how your audience goes in and moves through that. And then from that, we can go in and we can actually create a lot more high fidelity prototypes or higher fidelity prototypes inside of many of those same applications. Now we can start to break things down if we want images to change, if we want to go in and create a larger grid, if we want to have repeating grids, all of those things are available inside of there. So we go through our prototypes. A lot of times, like I said, we are dealing with low fidelity type prototypes. And then from there, we will continue to go in and begin to build up, and we get into our technical solutions. This is where we start dealing with or really thinking about the technology that's involved inside of here. So with that, we start getting into our alpha versions. So when we first start off, this is the first one, really crude. Then we start working into our various betas. And then you may even get all the way into the part when people start talking about their golden, the one that is what they plan to ultimately go through and release. Once we go through and work with that, once we go and we implement it, we're going to go ahead and we're going to launch it, we're going to promote it, we're going to update it, we're going to continue with ongoing testing. Now the challenge that we start working into interactives or anything that's from a digital standpoint is what is the actual life cycle of it? How long do we plan on this to be able to be used? If we're only using it for a weekend, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's designed, it's built. It's probably going to have minimal content for the weekend. If it's something that's designed to have longevity, how are we going to go ahead and start to work with this and actually future-proof it in the sense that the device it's running on, can that be updated to continue to run it? If they upgrade, if there's software upgrades based upon the software used, can we go through and update that? Information even with that. Because of the factor that we can quickly update information, the other thing we have on there is that your audience is also going to expect that information to be updated. So as we go through and we use it, you have to be aware if something changes, we update that information, we continue to focus on what is there. So we get into concept development. So when we go through and we start to think about it, this is what's driving everything else. So as we go through and we get into our design concept, what is it that we're doing? What is the goal of it? What does the brief state? So as we go through and we push the overall concept, it should address all of those items. What is that goal of the website? The website's goal is this. All right, are we doing that? If we go through, is it designed to be editorial? Is it designed to be informational? Is it designed there to promote something? Are we trying to get you to go through and purchase something? I mean, what is available? Is it just there to entertain? There are many, many, many websites out there that will come across that are simply there to entertain. At Christmas time, there's one Elf one where you can go in, you can take pictures of your family and place them in there, and all of a sudden you're all dancing around and singing elves. They're for pure entertainment. There's no other purpose for that than to entertain. As we start to think about the brand image, is that brand image being conveyed to you? What is it going through and saying? How are you working with the content across all the various media platforms? So if you do have a mobile app, how's that working? How's the web page working? How do the magazine advertisements play into it? How does your interactive game, mini game, or anything you're developing like that, how does that all play back into the brand? Now, usually as you go through and begin to work, there's going to be somebody who's in charge of it all anyways. And a lot of times that's going to be some sort of an agency or a studio, and they're tasked with keeping everything in line. Now with that, they go through and they develop the stuff, they put things together. They may maintain that all the way through. They may be in charge of designing everything. Or it may become one of those situations where they begin to take that and farm that stuff out to other people. And we start looking into our visual design. You know, go through and start to look at what is the content that's on there. How is it structured? How do you ultimately navigate the page? Start looking at its visual design. Is the visual interesting? Is it not? What's happening with typography on there? Is it functional? So one thing for me that is, you know, a big deterrent for me using a website and stuff is if it's not functional. I can't stand going on places and you're clicking on stuff, or if you can't even find where it is that you want to move, so even the interactivity part of it. So if I can't find the stuff that I want on there, I'm gone. If I find things hard to use, I'm gone. So as we go through and we start to think about that, all of that stuff goes back into play on what you have as an overall experience. That's why you could use something and be like, that's the best thing I've ever used. And I jump on and go, yeah, this is atrocious. So even things like forums, certain forums for me are really easy to use, other ones aren't. There's some that are designed for sharing content and are great to use, and people are really good with them. And for me, I get on and I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. How did you find that? Where did you get to that? So with that, and it just goes down to what you use. It's knowing your audience. I'm not their intended audience. So when I end up on there, I'm like, I don't have a clue what's going on here. Or somebody else gets on it and they know exactly where it is that they want to be with it. As we go through, we start to look at visualization. Is there a consistent look and feel with it? That consistent look and feel goes with everything that's currently with the organization. So the company, does it match into the overall identity that is already there? How are we using elements? How are we using the pieces? How do we know that as soon as we see this, it relates to that company? So as we start to look at that, I mean, the amount of years it took Nike to be able to remove the word Nike from the swoosh to know that that's still a Nike. So there's a lot of things that go into that. And those are all things that we have to go through and evaluate as we continue to expand out on the ideas. Visual design. So we're looking at the form and the function. How do they ultimately come together? If we go through and we start to work with items and we go and we think about, okay, how are we going to design this? What is it going to do? If we go through and we put those items together, what's going to end up happening with it is we are going to see this as beneficial. It's going to be a worthwhile experience for the end user. If you get into an area and you don't have the information, you don't know what's going on, it's not worthwhile. So I said it's a frustrating experience. And the downfall with it is if we're frustrated with one part or one aspect of a product, odds are we're going to turn it on and we're not going to go in and experience that again, or expose ourselves to the opportunity to experience that in a different light. When people go in, if you go shopping somewhere, you go there the first time, you have no clue where anything's at, you're lost the whole time you're in there, and you leave there, odds are you're not going to go back there again. So when we start to look at it, or maybe there's something specific, and I only go to the store for that item because I know right where it's at, and I walk in there and I can get it. Otherwise, I'm just lost in the store. So we start looking at where are things placed, why are they placed in there, and is it a worthwhile user experience? So it goes through everything in life. We're just moving it into the realm of the digital interactives. Now we get into images. We start to think about what is it that we are going to go in there and be using. This is dealing with photography, illustrations, icons, symbols, If you have textures or patterns inside of there, any graphs that may show up on it. If you're dealing with animations, maps, all that stuff goes in there, and those are all part of images. Those are the images that we're going to use. Now we go through and we start getting in images. Where are we getting the images from? There's a lot of places that we can get our images from. So we go and commission people for them. So if we have something specific that we want, we can have them go ahead and commission an illustrator or photographer to get those images for us, or we as the actual designer may go through and create them. So depending on what applications you use, there are applications that you wouldn't think of from a design standpoint, even something along the lines of Excel, and that you may generate a graph out of and then take a copy of that graph and use that in somewhere else just because it's handling the information better. It's even possible that you work with people, or you know somebody, you have a friend that you were in school with, anything you used to work with, that you know they work really well in a certain application. You say, well, I really could use that, so you contact them. As I said, a friend of mine, he doesn't write a bunch of raw HTML and that, but if he needs something coded, hard-coded for him to use, he has a friend who works one floor down from him. He just sends him an email, I need this, and the guy goes through and sits down and writes up all the code for him and sends it back to him. He just copies, pastes it into the document, and everything works. Of course, then he pays them for the time. So as we start to look at what's happening with, there's a lot of different people that we're going to go through and ultimately use to go in and select them. And one other place that we also go in and we get images from are stock locations. And a long time ago, there was only really one main stock source, and then there became two, and now there's like 100,000 of them. They're all over the place as to what we have as we start dealing with stock images. But as we go and we start to select what are we going to go in and put on the screen, or what are we going to create, we start thinking about optimizing images. So when we talk about optimizing them, we're talking about going in and creating them in their best form based upon the location in which we're going to deploy them. The reason why I want to do that is we're going to start looking at loading times, and we go and we get a website coming up. How long does it take for it to upload? Most places anymore have access to at least a relatively high-speed internet access. Very few people are on dial-up. There are still people on dial-up. Nothing against that. It's just know that their experience is going to be entirely different than the average user because they're using a speed much lower, so it's going to take longer for things to load. Understand what you have for your basic guidelines when it comes to formatting based upon, of course, where they're actually going to go to. And then as you go through to present them, you know, what happens if we push the image all the way off to the edge of the page versus giving some space between there? If we put images too close to one another, what happens? We still talk about margins, so what is our response to the edges of the format? So as we start to think about that, how are we going in there and using those, and what's going to happen with the presentation of it? We start getting into consistency. So when we talk about consistency on this, we're really looking at the standpoint of how are we seeing these? So when we go through, we start thinking about if we're cropping things, okay, are we cropping things consistently? If we're going and we're working with silhouettes, how are we working with those silhouettes that are in there? If we go way back, we talked about visualization. Are we being consistent with how we're going in and visualizing these things? So utilizing colors and tones and effects in that. How are we going through? Because remember, we're still looking at repetition. So we're repeating how we're treating these things to give us that consistency across the board. Are the images appropriate for the design concept? Now, this is one where a lot of times we get stuff that goes into them with is it something consistent with what their values are? If they are, then okay. So as we start to think about images, there's a lot more that goes into it than just I need a picture of a car. Okay, well, does this car work? Why are we using this car? What are the colors of the car? What's with that? We start looking at the basis. We've talked before, and we've dealt with posters and book covers. Start to think about what is the relationship between the images and the text that's going to be on there, both in look and in amount. What are we going to go through and start to look at? We start thinking about those icons. How are they staying consistent? But also don't be afraid though, how can we go through and work with potentially then a contrast in some of these to communicate something else? Typography. I've talked a few times about dealing with type as we get into working with it on a screen. Now the challenge as we get into a screen is everything is stuck to a grid. It has to be in a grid. It's a pixel-based grid. Pixel size is already defined by the screen itself. So as we go through and we start to work with it, we want to make sure that we get something that has an ample X height. So as we go through and talk about the height of those characters, we want to make sure that they are available to use and that it's tall enough. Because again, we're still looking at lines. So all our pixels, we start thinking about screen, we have horizontal lines, we have vertical lines. So our rows and our columns and where they intersect, each one of those little modules becomes a pixel. We have to use each one of those to form that height. So making sure they're tall enough, which means they'll render out properly. We go through and we start talking about open counters. Modest stroke contrast. So we go through and we start to look at it. As it starts to move, we want to make sure that we're able to still see those strokes if they're in there. Stroke weight, making sure it's sufficient enough. If you go in and choose something that has really thin lines in it, it is entirely possible that some of those are just not going to show up. So you can find that you lose a little bit of the text that's in there. So typically we try to push more towards a sans serif typeface. Instead, if we're dealing with something that's larger, display type, that we can get away with usually going in and still using it for the larger areas of type. And if we go through and try to make that small, we're going to actually struggle with it. We start looking at numbers. So we look at the numeral standpoint. Based upon how the strokes start to work with them. They can get really hard to see if we have really thin strokes that end up showing up on there. So really, when we go through and we also start to work with it, is we start to see that we're bumping our type up just a little bit. So maybe we normally use 10 if we're going in and printing, and all of a sudden we're using 12 on the screen. If we typically, this would be a 16 point for display, and what I'm working with on a print document, I got to bump that up to an 18 or maybe even a 20 to go in and allow it to actually show up right on a digital project that is of the same design. As we go in and we start to choose our text, we need to choose our text so that it's actually readable. So as we go and we start looking at readability, we want to go ahead and ensure that we have contrast. Because if we increase the contrast between the color of the type and our background color, what's going to happen is it's going to give us the best reading experience. So we do talk about black and white. We could also completely reverse that out. We could actually do white on black, but that's going to be a little bit more difficult to read because, of course, the amount of black that's going to be on the page. We'll also start to see the use of going in and dealing with red type even on a white background. And that's, again, that goes back to your traditional colors of black, white, and red when we start looking at it from a graphic design standpoint. As I said, you can put white on there. If you use white text on black, or we call knockout type or reverse type, then you typically, again, you want to make sure that you're choosing something that is a sans serif. You get into the serifs, you get into any type of thinning out strokes on digital. It just gets really hard to read. So just keep that in mind as we go through and begin to use it. I know that as we go through and we start to work that bright colors are actually going to go in and detract from the readability. So if we go through and we start looking at that, we may have to actually still bump the pixel size up as we go and we sort of deal with that. Yes?
Like, you don't want to make your entire page flashy neon colors and stuff like that, to the point where it's unbearable to read towards the ends.
Right, so as we go through, we start to work with it. When we look at colors and colors that are next to each other, colors that are on top of each other, we start looking at the whole standpoint of, they create essentially like a vibration to it. So as we go through, we start to choose them. We want to make sure that, can we use bright colors? Yes, we can. They're going to grab your attention. But just know that they're going to be a lot more difficult to go through and read. So if we go through to start to work with that, if we have something we're dealing with a saturated color, we may have to find that we have to once again increase the pixel size for us to go through and actually read what is on there. As we start talking about line lengths, so as we go through, we start to run the text across the page. We want to go ahead and reduce what we have for the line lengths on screen versus print. So typically with that, we want to keep the line lengths really no more than about 12 words. It's really a very loose setup based upon, of course, how long each of the words ends up being. But as we go through to read it, we can read a lot more on a printed page than we're actually going to be able to read on a digital page. But there's a lot of things that happen that impact that. What's the overall size of the text? If we're going larger, yeah, we're going to be able to fit fewer on there. If I take the same 8.5 by 11, running 10 points for type size, and I turn around and have to run 12 because it's digital, naturally we're going to have smaller line lengths anyways. So as we go through, we start to look at that. Just know that you're reviewing that, you're looking at what's on there, because yes, there are some devices that are rather large. I've got a 13-inch iPad, and yes, I could fit an awful lot of text going across that. Design the type in chunks. So with that, we go through and we start thinking about the text. We got into chunking before with stuff. So start looking at how are we working with what's here. If we have this really large text box that just shows up on the screen, it's not too inviting for us to come in and want to be a part of that. So we prefer to read our text in smaller chunks or shorter paragraphs. As we go through and we start to think about it, if we go through and we start using any type of condensed type style, so text that's very close to each other, it's going to reduce the visibility, the readability of it, I should say. Because again, we're still dealing with those pixels. So we have those vertical columns, those guides, the spaces between them. We need to provide enough space for us to go in and recognize where we are at inside of it. Another thing we go and we start thinking about what's happening with type is we've talked before about voice and branding. So when we get into there, make sure that what you're saying or what type you're choosing actually is consistent with the brand identity. How is it talking? What are we seeing? What's happening with it? The type alone can help us differentiate one brand from another. So how are we going through to take advantage of that and using it? The other thing too is start to look at what's happening with any type of face that you choose. Make sure it's not going to fight against what we have for that logo. So provide space. If there's text around it, you're using a logo, go ahead and use it. And then of course, always verify that what you have or what you're choosing is speaking the same way. The voice is consistent with what we have for the overall brand itself. Now grids. We've used grids in the past. We use grids in design. The nice thing that grid goes through is grids are going to create opportunities for us to go through and essentially unify what's happening. As we go from page to page inside of the document, how is it going to go in there? Because that's the overall structure that's there. It's kind of like when you go into a high-rise building, each floor has a similar structure to it, both from an architectural standpoint, but also from a visual standpoint. So it helps us know what's happening as we move through there. So it gives us unity and also harmony throughout what we have for our design. The other thing this actually provides, much like we talk about for a high-rise, is it provides them the basic anatomical structure of what it is we're working with. Where's the header? Where's the footer? Where are the feature areas that we're going to have inside of here? Where are we adding content at? Or what's the overall body of the design? What are we going to be creating for positive and negative shapes, backgrounds? Like I said, we start looking at where are the bars at. Do we have menus on the left, menus on the right, menus on the top, menus on the bottom? Where exactly is everything at? What items are going to be pinned or fixed into a location so that as we go through and move, they're not going to move at all. It also goes through and helps create us that visual style that we have on there. So with that, we've got the web grid that's set up. We know where things are going to be at. We can go through and we can start to break it down. It also identifies the characteristics of the overall design. We can also work with multi-column grids. So as we go and we start to think about what's happening inside of our design, what is it that we're able to go through and use, or how are these things going to ultimately function with it? So the grid, as we go through and we put it in there, as we go and start to build with the multi-column grids really provides us a little bit more flexibility as we get into the responsive design. So as we go through and we begin to move the page size, or we take it from device to device, what happens with that is it's more flexible, because now we can go ahead and we can have possibly one grid can disappear. We can, if we expand it out, we can add an additional grid into that. It's just a lot more fluid as we go through and build this out. We go through and we look at it. Google actually, their design is built off of a 12-column grid. We want to go in and see kind of what happens as we go in and begin to use them. We're talking about positive and negative space. So as we go through and we begin to build these items, the negative space that we have on any digital space or digital page has to be thought out. So we start looking at the margins. So the space that we have going around the outside of it. So left, top, right, and bottom edge of it. What's going to happen with that? How are designs responding to those margins? We talk about the padding. Heard this used many times. That's the overall space then that we have between the border and the image itself. What are we working with in there? How much space do we need? As we start to work with our line spacing. So if we move the copy out, what happens when we expand it out? We get more negative space between there. It can make things easier to read. It changes the color. So we start thinking from a tonal standpoint. As we expand that out, you take text that's black on white and you put it really close, it's really dense. If we expand out that line spacing, all of a sudden it lightens up as we start to look at the color. And then even looking at how are we spacing out between individual paragraphs. So as we've pushed through and start to think about these, realistically, anything that we design anymore, I have a hard time isolating out web design from actually mobile design, because really we're viewing all of them on mobile devices. So when we start looking at it, really what we're thinking about, or some people when they talk about website design versus mobile design, is that sometimes they'll take it, even though they don't in here. Websites are just that, websites designed, thought of strictly on a desktop, and mobile designs are more designed in the standpoint of apps. There were websites that were designed specifically for mobile devices some time ago. They still are out there, but usually it's a responsive design that we have on there. But really when we start thinking about it from a mobile design standpoint, most people think of it as an app standpoint. You know, there's an app for that, there's an app for that. So really when we go through, they are similar to what we have on a desktop. On a desktop, if it's a browser-based, then to me it's very similar or almost identical to a desktop. So we run into all those same things. Where are we putting information? What's going to happen with it? However, the big difference is we go back to the fact that as we go through and we start to build things, or we think about it from a mobile standpoint, is that you've designed it with the intention is that this is primarily going to be used on a mobile device, a much smaller screen that has some sort of touch interface and is also designed to be handheld. So that's really the big difference. So it goes back to talking about, are we designing from small to big or big to small? If it's designed, it's a mobile design, it's designed small, that may be able to go and go big. If it's actually designed as a more along the lines of a website or desktop, then of course it's designed big, and then it could be potentially used on a smaller device. It is important as we go in and we start to work with something on a phone is that we go and we really start to use that grid system, because what's happening with that is it really sets us up as to specifics based upon how many pixels we have, wide, tall. What we really get into though is we do have framework that's in here. There's Google's list on there. But as we start looking at the framework, what do we have? What's the typical size of everything on that individual mobile device? So you can go in and you can download the UI for Apple, and it's set on there so you can go and drag and drop things in there if you're designing a mobile application. You don't have to do all of that from scratch. And then a lot of the stuff is it's designed in a way that once you utilize it, the coding is in there so that it's pulling the stuff out of the actual system as well. So we go through, we start designing it. We're really going in and really looking at the content. What's the content? What do we need to get into this? Where does the stuff have to be in there? Versus going in there and saying necessarily, this is the size I have. As you begin to add stuff to the space, what's going to happen with it is you are going to end up breaking down to a point where you may have to start to choose certain items to include, not include. Again, it goes back to menu choices. Ultimately, what are we going to end up doing as we get back into those other areas? So what are the graphic spaces that you have in there? How are you using them? That goes right back to that grid system. As we start to think about the spaces, how much space do we have? go through and define just exactly what those margins are. Make sure they're consistent. So if we're going in there and saying for every 2 pixels that we're going to create in padding for width, we're going to only be able to do 2 in height, or maybe it's 2 in width and 3 in height. Are we staying on that 4x3 on the iPad? Are we going to that 3x2 on the iPhone? How are you going to have those things going there? And just keep them consistent. Because again, it's that repetition that we have in there. It's kind of like making music. So we're in there having that repetition playing its way through it all. With it, you're going to have stylistic choices as well. So we go through and we start to build it. We have the visual hierarchy. We know how to see stuff. We know it's priority based on information, based on what we see, what we interact with. What's the most important part of it? It might be here to entertain, but then at the end of it, there may be a link to something. That's fine. You know, is it important that the person click through? Maybe not. So as we start to build these, along with it, we want to go ahead, and these things are unified by using the grid, but at the same part, we want just a little bit of variety inside of there so that it's not the same thing over and over again. It's kind of like we could go through and I could make the presentation really, really monotonous and sounding. Exact same pacing. We can go through and we can build that stuff, but that's not what we want. So we start getting those areas. There's consistency, but then there's also a little bit of variety that's going to exist inside of it. So what are those really key things we have to go in and pull off of when we start to work on things that are mobile? Is first off, you know, does the current download allow you to actually get it quick? 15 seconds to load stuff. 15 seconds. If it takes 15 seconds to load on your mobile phone, you're going to probably think it's miserable, right? It's a long time, but it's really not at the same time. So as we start to think about that, how quick can we get stuff to download? Does it allow you to communicate? If so, quickly. You know, before you could click on, you know, phones recognizing numbers to be able to click on them to make phone calls right from the numbers. You had to, of course, memorize that or write it down and then go to your phone. Now we can, of course, just click on them and we can make phone calls. We can click on all those hyperlinks in there and go ahead and just link to other pages. So how are we going to navigate it? Someone's going to find what they want quickly as they go through and scroll with it. The margins. What's going to happen with the margins? As we go through and we start to look at things, we have very little real estate on a smartphone. So how much do we have there for margins? Clicking on things. Anybody else in here have a case on their phone, and then sometimes you go to a page and you want to be able to click on something and you're trying to click on it but you can't get over there because your case keeps you those 3 pixels too far in? Yeah. So what happens with that? Well, for me, it's one of those where I question, is it really the case that's causing the problem, or is it the design that's the problem? And for me, I kind of go to the design, but that's just me, because why would it be the case? So what can you do with that? And really, that's just about being aware that those things may go in there and work. Don't go through and create things that look like they should be able to be clicked on that they can't be clicked on. So why is that there? What's that image? What's the size of that image? What's the size of the areas that I'm going to be clicking on? What's happening with those? Does it take me outside of there? Because what happens when we go outside of our own site? How much control do we have over the content they're going to?
0.
0. That's exactly right. We have no control over that, which means if they click on a link on your site and it takes them to another site, and that site takes forever to load, who are they going to probably come back and make a comment about, like, this website's horrible? I don't know why you even use it. Us. Because we sent them to it. It's kind of like if I sit there and I go, oh, this person's it's a really great company. If you go there and you give them $1,000, they're going to give you the best computer and experience ever. And you go there and then you give them $1,000 and you come back and the computer's absolute garbage. Who are you upset with?
Person that recommended it.
Right, the recommender. And that's the person who directs you there. So as we go through and we start to look at it, be careful as to where you send people to. And then understand what's happening in the context when we're using these different devices. What are they going to be asking for? How are we using it? Do we use it with sound, no sound? Are we using it with one hand, 2 hands? So it goes down to anything that you're interacting with. What happens? You go to landscape and have to use 2 hands. Okay, what does that keep you from being able to do outside of there? And then we move from that, we get into motion design, or we start getting into animation. So start thinking like After Effects and that, where we're going to go through, we're going to start to simulate what's going on with stuff. So this is where we get into a way to really easily show people how to do stuff versus telling them. You sit there and say, well, you need to do this, this, and this. Well, that's fine. But how can we go about showing them? And that's what we can start to do through action in motion design. So this allows us to go in and take something that may be very complex, comprehensive, and simplify how we go in and do it based upon creating these motion designs with that. So what is that we can go through and work with? Entertaining people, again, promoting things for informational purposes. So all the reasons why we go through and begin to do them. If we go there and we start to look at it, most of your media channels are going to provide opportunities for you to go in and start to think about motion design. Yes, even we start talking about printing with lenticular stuff that when you turn, simply pivot it, all of a sudden you can see like motion from it because of that. It still goes into it's a motion design idea, but with that it's no tech. So we start to think about what's there, how are we going to go in and use it. Motion is time-based. So with that, we're creating relationships from objects from one step to the next. So as we go through and we begin to build it, we start talking about temporal changes. Temporal meaning time-based or temporal relationships, and where is something at this time versus this other time. So as we go through and start to build those, how do they work? We are setting these up to happen over a specific amount of time. So if I have this animation that's going to go through and run, it takes 10 seconds. We have to know that as we go through and design it, that it is based on that. The other thing it starts to work off of is that we're going to start to look at the order of the events. So are they chronological? Do they need to be chronological? As we go through and we start to work with them, do we have to flow on these one after another? As we go through and we start to build them, how are these different things going to go in and play with the rest of the system? As we start to look at making things move, we're going to step through there. Now we look at it from a motion design. Motion design, there's a lot of things that can happen with this. Motion design, yes, does go into full-on just animations. Motion design can also be done through interactivity. So we make things move from place to place, and we start looking at the factor of do they have to go in that chronological order or not. Motion design provides us a lot of flexibility, but it does go back into and plays off of what we talked about before with writing out things. How do I show somebody how to do something versus telling them? How do I show them to make a difference versus telling them how to go about making a difference? So this provides us opportunities to go in and work. We start talking about it from a speech standpoint. We tell somebody something, what percent's going to go through and do it, versus showing somebody, how to do something, how many are going to go through and do it, versus going through and showing and telling them at the same time. That's why a lot of times we go through and we start looking at learning how to do things, and we're going through animations. We're listening to somebody do something, and we're also watching them do it, which allows us both to go through and do it, like I said, from a visual standpoint and an auditory standpoint. And then if you're a kinesthetic learner, if you're watching somebody, listening to somebody, and doing it, then the amount of information that actually is able to move from one part to the next goes much, much higher. As we go through and we start to put into motion anything, as we go in, we really start to think about designing anything. There's the storytelling aspect of it. There's a narrative on there. What is it that you want to say with it? So this is the idea. I want somebody to see this. I want somebody to know this. How am I going to go through and do that? Well, I'm going to go through and I'm going to plan this. So that's our pre-production side of it. We're going to go through and we're going to start thinking about the story. What does it look like? What does it sound like? How is it going to move? What needs to move? And then we're going to storyboard that out. Depending on how long we have for the animation, will really depend on the frames. We talk about here about 4 or 6 frames, just as a guide. Those would be, if you think about it from a standpoint, we talk about key framing. Those are the key frames in it, these 4 to 6 key frames. There's all this motion and action that takes place in between them. So we go through and we drive it, we build the style, we choose the music, we choose the sounds, and we go through and we start to build those. That's what's going to be in there. That's how we're going through and communicating with them. Everything that goes into this is going to be built for it. So what are the characters? What are the forms, the textures? Do you need specific sounds? How does it work back in with the color palette based upon what it is that you had designed before? As we start to look at it, there's a lot of different things we can do for animation. We look at the old style cell-based animations, so thinking like flipbook concepts. How are you going to go through and communicate it? As we start to look at time-based, as we start to look at animating, what all parameters do we have to go through and animate? What can happen with stuff? How can we show things just turning into something else? What are we going for? So we start thinking about the size relationships from one another, the space relationships. So we start looking at things in proximity to one another. What does that communicate? What are we really trying to appeal to? Are we trying to appeal to your emotional side? And if we are, what are we using for that? And think about what impacts that. You know, colors, sights, sounds. What's happening with the spoken word, the dialogue that's inside of it? What's happening with the typography that's going to show up on the screen? We go through the images as we get into sound. It's a major part in animating. Do we want the sounds? If something falls, do we want to make a noise from it, or is it just going to fall and go off the page? So everything that we're seeing in there is going to assist us in telling the story. A lot of times when you start with it, we're going to start with music. Why do we start with music?
Because music can draw someone to an ad or a website.
Right, it can draw them into it, but what it really provides to us is that as we start to animate stuff, things happen with sound. So we can use the sound to emphasize what's there. So when we start getting the rhythm, what's the pace that things are going to move? So if we have, music that's just like dum, 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 dum. If we have motion, somebody walking, we're probably going to try to pair that up to where they're stepping down at each beat as they go through with it, because it's going to provide us what's there. It's that foundational rhythm to it. Just like when we read stuff. It's the same thing as reading music. When we go through and read things, the spacing of the words, you go and you put words and you put a bunch of space between them, have somebody read it. And you'll hear that there's still going to be that breakdown. You're providing the space, same thing happens. So as we go through and we start to create music, that's going to be the foundation. It's going to help us pace the things. If we have like a really fast beat going on, our actions inside of this motion part, or this interactive one, is going to have to move quicker, because we're going to be still following on those beats. And then also when we go in and we get started with it, is how do you want it to begin and how do you want it to end? So when we go through and we start thinking about interactions, I talk about this inside of my After Effects class, we go in, is that you know where everything wants to end at. So for example, they just finished doing animations for a sporting event. So they know how the animation wants to end. How do we get there? It's kind of like, in the end, I want to have a PhD in astrophysics. Well, how do I get there? I don't go walk into the college classroom and be like, oh, okay, here I am. Don't know where I'm going. No, we know what we want. So the same thing happens as we go and we design it. We start with that last frame, and then, so this is what it's going to end like. This is where I'm going to begin at. So then we go through and we put the rest of the pieces that are inside of there. So we start thinking about the additional elements. Same thing happened in old cell-based animation. When with all the Disney stuff was going on, Disney didn't draw every single thing. These are the key frames. This is where I want the talent to be at, the characters to be at this given moment. He did the key frames, and then they got passed off to other animators who went in and made the people move as necessary to get from one point to the other. That's ultimately what happens with the director that's inside of there. So we know where we're going, we know where we begin, and then we develop the story or put the story together between those 2 points. So as we go through and we start to tell the story, it's just like any story that you go through and begin to tell, is that we actually have to have a well-defined design concept. This is exactly what I want to do with it. We have to have that color palette that's there. It's going to unify the whole thing. Also, as we start to work with the colors, it's going to go ahead and appeal to the audience. It's going to help create the drama. It's also going to give us our focal points. What are we seeing? Why are we seeing? What do we need to pay attention to inside of there? If we go through and we start to change scales and spatial depth, it gives us that third dimension. This impacts that there could possibly be a third dimension inside of there. And it also goes through, as we start to move them, is it gains interest. As things move, they grab our attention. They grab our attention, we become interested in them. If we get interested in them, we get engaged in them. If we get engaged in them and we can recognize the hierarchy of all the elements that are on the page, text, images, and that, we will naturally move on through those. The other thing we start getting into is avoid flatness. You know, as we go through, we have that ability to control depth. Anytime we start moving things, if things move on diagonals, they're a lot more dynamic than if they move flat. So what is that we can do to actually increase that? Sound, key thing. Just like movies. You go through and you sit and listen to a horror movie and you turn the sound off. It's not frightening when someone shows up on the page because there isn't the suspense built before all of a sudden, you know, the light shines over and there's somebody in the corner. It also gives you visual beats for it, and then as we go through and always are working with it, what is our audience doing? Where are they going? What is the journey that we are taking them on?